Okay, welcome to episode 119 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Anne Power. Anne is a couple counsellor and has taught psychotherapy and supervision on university courses in London. She has published many academic papers on attachment and two books. She started her counselling work 30 years ago. Her initial training was as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist with a special interest in attachment theory, and posts on Instagram most days with supportive ideas about relationships. That's at Attachment. And her TEDx talk provides a brief overview of attachment theory and has over 600,000 views. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
So it's really lovely having you back on the podcast. I originally reached out a couple of years ago to have you on. We talked about your first book, Contented Couples. And then I was at the talk you gave in November in London, and you were talking about attachment theory in boarding school. And I was like, oh, I'd love for you to go into a little bit more depth on the podcast. So invited you back. It's lovely to have you here.
Well, I'm really, really grateful to be asked.
Yeah. So if we begin at the beginning again with attachment theory, I'd love for you to just talk a little bit. What is it? And the different forms. What are the different forms of attachment, please?
Hmm. So, attachment theory came into being led by John Bowlby, who was a psychoanalyst in London about 100 years ago. And he, uh, unusually for a psychoanalyst, took a more scientific view. He was very interested in evolution. And so he wasn't only interested in what goes on inside people, but also the impact of the environment. And the theory which came out of that is one that describes the infant's response to the particular parents they have. So what he and his researchers demonstrated, and since then it's become a kind of global movement through universities around the world, very young infants adapt their behavior to get the best care possible from the given caregivers they have. So the given mother or father or whoever looks after them um, tends to will have a certain personality. They will have an attachment pattern themselves. They may be one of the ones that's quite easy to describe is avoidant attachment, which is um, people who are uncomfortable with strong feelings, particularly vulnerable feelings, feelings of need and connection, and the longing to connect. And if the parents carry that pattern within them, they um, they kind of pass it on to their children because the children realize my mum is a very good mum, provided I don't make a fuss, provided I don't cry, I don't show how upset I am. And this happens very young, so that when researchers test infants of 13 months, they can assign them to the groups. So one of the groups, as I've said, is avoidant attachment. Um, the main group, I'm happy to say, is secure attachment, but it's not massively the main group, sort of 60%. People who are securely attached have had caregivers who are available, responsive, accessible, attuned to them, and reliable. Reliable is very important. But avoidant parents are usually very reliable, but they're reliably cool and reserved. Whereas secure parents are reliably attuned. They are open to picking up the experience of the infant and the child and then responding to it. They're not frightened of their child's feelings. Um, so people who've had a secure start are very well placed for sort of everything in life. They usually do well at school. I'm thinking of a satisfactory day school here. They
Mm.
do well in with friendships. They get on with teachers. They tend to then it's easier for them to choose a satisfactory relationship and sustain it. And they tend to do better in the workplace because they're connected to themselves. I'll say more about that later because this is meant to be the preliminary bit, wasn't it? So I've covered secure people. Avoidant people are very reserved. We call it stiff upper lip in the UK. Um, they can get on very well in certain circumstances. The problem is that they can't handle difficult feelings either within themselves or coming from other people. So when they become parents themselves, they're kind of doing this emotionally to their children and also to their partner. Um, and of course, when really big life events happen, then the huge feelings will tend to burst through, and that's very, very discomforting for these people because they've got no emotional equipment for regulating. Um, Quite often, they might use alcohol or some other kind of addictive practice to help them keep everything down. Then the other quite significant insecure group, the few names for them. They're mostly called anxiously attached, also called ambivalent, ambivalent about relationships, and um, preoccupied with relationships actually, because people in this group have had an experience of parents who are intermittently available. So as a little child, they know that their, let's say, mother is sometimes really there and can be warm and supportive and understanding. Other times she's switched off. Now, this could be 101 reasons. It could be grief. The mother could be in mourning. She could be depressed. Um, she could be uncomfortable, very uncomfortable about her own inner world. Um, Alcoholism can sometimes produce an on-off kind of parenting. So any kind of on-off parenting gives the child this very strange experience. They know that the parent is capable of being loving and attuned and responsive, but a lot of the time they're not getting it. So what these children do, where the avoidant children damp it all down, the ambivalent children ramp it up or amp it up. So they over express their feelings. They make more of a sort of, should we call it, more of a fuss than they need to, because they know that they're about, if they've got their parents' attention, they're probably about to lose it. And a lot of the time they don't have it. So they're trying to get it. So they put the volume up on their feelings. Um, and it's not, on the whole, it's not a great strategy out there in the world. In their family, it was the best thing to do because that was a way to get some care from their parents. But it it takes up a lot of the person's own energy, and which ideally would be going towards playing or learning or these kind of things. Um, so it doesn't work well for children. Often it interferes with education, especially in boarding school. We can get around to that. And it doesn't tend to go terribly well in relationship. But what tends to happen in the world, you very often get, people will recognize this because it's so common. You very often get someone who's a bit avoidant with someone who's a bit ambivalent, anxious. And we can say more about relationships further down the line, but that can produce quite a cycle, a difficult cycle. And then the other final group we could mention are called, the researchers call them disorganized attachment. These are people whose parents really are not equipped for the job. So the parents are more troubled than the parents of the avoidant or the anxious. These are parents who are probably either frightening or frightened themselves. So we know that emotions are contagious. So if a parent themselves is desperately anxious and frightened, the child just imbibes that. Um, One of the very neat descriptions of children in this group um, is that the parents are frightening, and then the child has an experience of fright without solution because they're in a dilemma. This person who is my caregiver, the only sort of potential anchor I have in the world, is also frightening me. So do I run towards for safety or do I run away for safety? And that horrible kind of oscillation goes with them through life. It's because it's in the nervous system. I mean, I don't mean therapy can't help. People can be helped, but without intervention, we will tend to stay in these groups, avoidant, anxious, or disorganized. And in adulthood, disorganized attachment can produce very behaviors that are very troubling for the person. It makes it difficult to have relationships and hold down a job.
Mm. Thank you. That's really great and very clear enunciation, explanation about the four different attachment figures. And I can resonate with a few of them as you go through them, thinking, oh, actually, I hadn't thought of that, especially the disorganized. I was very frightened of my father growing up. I
Mm.
used to run away a lot. And so, yeah, but my mother, I had a more loving relationship with her. So, mm, thank you. So, I'd love for us to move in a little bit to boarding school, to how these four types, you know, relate to, okay, day one, I arrive as a secure, day one, I arrive as a avoidant. How that looks like, you talked about this in the talk you gave.
Mm. Mm. I think the reason I think this is an important question is there's been really wonderful work, and people who've read in the field will know Nick Duffel and Joy Chavarin's writing, which has really helped people understand the impact of boarding on children. Um, and in attachment terms, we would worry particularly about young children, so the sort of under 12 especially. Um, the younger, the worse, really. Um, so John Bowlby, who founded attachment theory, had been sent at, I think it was 8, it might have been 7, at the sort of traditional prep school age for the upper classes. And he said, I wouldn't send a dog to boarding school.
Mm.
So secure children, I've said how well they tend to do in the world. And in most situations, being securely attached is gives people resilience. So if something bad happens, like a parent becoming ill, or the child may be having a severe injury, or whatever bad kind of thing you might think of, being secure often gives people resilience because they're able to turn to their their other caregiver, or let's hope they've got more than one. They might have a granny or someone. Um, they're able to turn to a trusting adult and receive help. They're open to being helped. Um, and they have we call it a view of self as lovable. They can believe they are lovable, which is the most wonderful gift for a child to grow up with, which the insecure children don't have. Um, but I think that rather uniquely, boarding school is a is an absolute catastrophe for these children because everything that they have learned to trust is just taken away. It sort of turns their world upside down. And the evidence is from children who were secure and are sent to boarding school as adults when they reflect. They say, I just couldn't believe my parents would do that to me. And once I got to the boarding school, I realized what it was like. And I was sure my parents would take me away. I would tell them, and they trusted their parents. So they were almost quite confident. My parents won't leave me here when they realize how awful it is. But of course, that's not what happened because the parents had a different agenda. They were going under the premise that this is good for my child. And a lot of those parents of secure, the secure families, the parents will also say, well, we were very torn. We really, part of us wanted to take him or her out of school. We couldn't bear to see them so unhappy, but we were convinced it was for their long-term benefit. So the kind of social myth, well, it's not entirely a myth, of course, in our culture,
Mm.
but the stories of privilege that you get the right friends, the right name on your school, on your CV, and your future is made. It's not a complete myth. It works for some children. Anyway, I think secure children, it's it's like a real calamity for them. The children who do sort of best in boarding school, in my view, are the avoidant children because they've been practicing for this all their lives. Their homes were like a mini boarding school in a way, where
Mm.
you follow the rules and things go fine. Um, so arriving in a place where you have to do as you're expected. No one wants to know how you're feeling inside. You don't expect much from adults, and you don't get it. These children know how to fit in. So that may mean that they can benefit from the good education which is available in many boarding schools, not all, but in many, and all the other kind of benefits. They can to some degree thrive there. Where they won't be thriving is in their own internal emotions. And for them, the problems may show up much further down the line in sustaining a contented long-term couple relationship. So that's the avoidant group.
Mm.
Then the anxious, the preoccupied, that group who could be called anxiously attached or preoccupied with attachment, they suffer very badly because all their early life, let's say they go to boarding school when they're 8, up to that point, um, they've been using a lot of energy to try and manage their parents, to keep them in view, keep them in the mind of the parent, because they know the parents forget about them. Um, and they're always worried that they're going to drop out of mind, that they're going to be forgotten. And then the thing they've always feared happens in the most catastrophic way. They are literally landed in this place with strangers and left there with very little access to their parents. And I do realize that sometimes I went to boarding school myself very young, and I do slightly talk in the old idiom. And I know modern boarding schools, people have much more access to parents. So I realize there are some changes, but I'd be happy to think about how much difference those changes make, because I don't think it makes a massive difference, because a young child needs their parent to be available at the
Yes.
end of the day.
I heard someone say that recently, whether it was at the boarding school survivors support day is, a phone is not a parent. You can't
Yes.
hug a phone.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
heard a story recently of someone saying that their child called, they had an hour that they could use their phone a day at boarding school, and for the 5 minutes they would talk to their parents. For the other 55 minutes, they would stay on the line, but they just needed that attachment and they would do other things in their room, but they just needed to know. And how heartbreaking is that to know
It
that
is
that.
heartbreaking. But it's also sort of that kind of lovely. There's the lovely side to it, which was there was a responsive parent, but the shame is that they weren't able to say, well, actually, why not be at home? And then we can,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So, so the
And then just to say, the disorganized people arriving at boarding school is going to be very hard for them because they find it difficult to, even when they're kind of like trying very, very hard, they have so much trouble regulating feelings and are so easily triggered because of the distress that they carry at all the difficult things that have happened to them. Some, maybe some abusive things at home. Um, they'll find it difficult to behave in the way that is expected of them. And we could also say that under that umbrella, children with different neurodiversities, um, they will have different attachment strategies. There isn't one attachment strategy that matches neurodiversity. You can be secure or insecure. Um, Quite a lot of neurodivergent people are insecure because parents have found it difficult to adapt appropriately to the particular needs of the child. But those children, they can of course do well at boarding school. Sometimes some boarding schools, there's the sort of regimented system can work, and the opportunity for special interests that some schools have. You might find another child who shares your intense interest in I think what they call those little figures.
Warhammer.
Warhammer, or some whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then you've got them with you can talk to your little friend all day and half the night about Warhammer. It could work in some cases, but very often children who are more impulsive or very sensitive to certain stimuli, there's not going to be any special understanding or responsiveness to their needs, so they could really suffer and be bullied.
Mm, thank you. I remember at my school on the first year, there was some people who were quite into Dungeons and Dragons. I was into skateboarding when I got there, but I noticed no one else was skateboarding. So I was avoidant and I was like, I'm not taking my skateboard here.
Yes.
Those guys, they played Dungeons and Dragons, but they were ostracized for it because they were seen as weird. So it was
Mhm.
almost like you could do extracurricular activities, but as
Mhm.
long as they were what the school wanted you to do rather than,
Mhm.
you know,
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
so it's kind of, yeah, it's like that avoidant. I will do what mom and dad want me to do rather than.
Yeah.
And I loved in your paper, the one you did 2013, you said something securely attached people, the parents kind of bend to the child's needs, whereas the
Mm.
avoidant, the child bends to the
Yes.
parents' needs. And I feel
Yes.
that's very much what boarding school is. It's
Yeah.
these are the rules. Well, I want to go to bed later. Doesn't matter.
Oh, forget that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think just in case for people who are new to attachment theory, we wouldn't want to give the impression, which I know you're not, but that secure parenting means you indulge the child in everything. It doesn't mean that at all. So it might well be that a secure parent will say it is time for bed, and the child may protest loudly. The secure parent can hold the line, but in a loving way. So they can be absolutely firm. It is bedtime. I see you're annoyed. I know you're fed up. You really wanted to play longer, but it is bedtime. And I'm saying it, and it is. It's not about um, giving the child everything they want. It is about giving attention to understand the child's experience. And it might be their experience of disappointment that they can't stay up.
Yeah, it's like a negotiation rather
Yeah.
than a word
Respect is respectful.
respectful. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So, you know, the secure children, because this is one of the arguments I've heard from the boarding school lobby, is saying that the reason children don't thrive at boarding school is that they didn't have good enough parenting before they went. That was an argument which came out last year in
Mhm.
a paper in a book.
Interesting.
What would you say to that?
Well, I don't find that at all convincing. Perhaps slightly flippantly, I rolled my eyes. Um, that doesn't work at all for me. I'm very convinced that the children who appear to thrive in boarding school the most are the avoidant children because they can adapt for the reasons we've just said. Um, it's normal to them to adapt to the system. The system was their family, and now it's the school. Um, and avoidant parenting is not ideal parenting at all, um, because it doesn't allow the growing person to be connected to themselves, to know their own feeling and experience. Um, so it alienates us from ourselves, an avoidant upbringing. Um, and people who, I'm sure there are children who've had difficult parenting at home, let's say the disorganized families, they will not be able to benefit from boarding school. So that would fall under what's being described there. But they are mercifully a minority because that's really a miserable experience to have growing up in a really disorganized home. Um, but it's my view from um, evidence through clients and having been in boarding school and have a lot of long-term connections, that being secure before boarding school does not equip you well for thriving in boarding school because it's such a, certainly I'm talking particularly pre-12 here, it is such a betrayal of the child's trust. The secure child is safe because they know that whatever happens, their parents will be there for them. This is why in kind of war zones and terrible crises, children can come out of it in fairly good shape, provided they can be close with their parents. And during the Second World War, when there was the evacuation of children from London for their physical safety, Bowlby and also Winnicott wrote to the Times saying, we're not sure this is at all a good idea because actually children are safer and develop a good emotional strength. So they feel safe and they feel safe if they're with their parents. So the parents may feel, oh, my little ones are safe now because they're down in Devon. Meanwhile, the little ones down in Devon, apart from the fact, of course, that they might have gone into an abusive family, even if they've gone to a nice family, but like even if they've gone to a nice boarding school, they're not going to feel safe thinking their parents are getting bombed. It just doesn't work. So um, I've slightly taken a bit of a tangent, but no, I disagree very strongly with that hypothesis that's been put forward.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I think I remember from your paper, I think it might be the 2007 one, about securely attached children is the only way for us to cope with in our minds is to say that I must be bad. There must be something wrong with
Yeah.
me
Mm.
because my parents are good. They've
Yeah.
securely attached, so therefore there must be something wrong with me. So that's, I found that very powerful.
That is so good. But I must make it, there's definitely this point comes from an important psychoanalyst of the past, his name is Fairbairn, and he calls it the moral defense. And the child, it's so important for a child to have a good parent that they make themselves bad. So I know I need to know my parent is good, even though they hit me. I know they're good, so I'm obviously bad, and they were right to hit me. And that's the child argues it that way because they're safer like that. And
Mm,
this is the sort of evolutionary angle that Bowlby took. The child will do what it needs to get the best care it can. And if the only parents I've got hit me, well, then I better believe they're still good parents and I'm the one who's bad. Because if I think they're bad parents, I'm even worse off.
yeah, 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 yeah. Thank you. So, what about avoidance? How do they cope with the separation from home?
Well, they're the children who feel at least they are likely. There are not everyone feels homesickness, and avoidant children um, tend to just sort of get on with it. And if they are reasonably bright and quite good at sport, then they're probably going to be able to do pretty well.
Mm, mm. Would you say that the other out of the four, the four different types of attachment, would you say that the one that everyone's kind of almost pushed into, is it avoidant? So the securely attached
Yes.
people, you know, the
Mm,
the anxious, because I had that
mm,
in my school. There was a boy who was anxious. His parents were older. He was smaller, and he was kicked, pushed, and whenever he was touched, he would scream.
mm,
And, so people would do it more. And
mm,
eventually, people would kick him in the dining hall, 800 people in the dining hall. He would scream at the top of his lungs, and the older girls would come and say, "Oh, are you okay?" Then, after he'd done it for a few weeks, and all of the dining hall one time he screamed, they just said, "Shut up," in a unison voice, and he never did it again.
it's so
Imagine the
interesting.
shaming.
Yeah. That is very interesting that the that united shut up was so shaming, and that was more powerful than all these terrible kicks. Yeah, which makes sense. I mean,
Mm,
most people who experience physical abuse say that the emotional abuse was worse. Mm.
mm, yeah.
That makes I so I agree with what you said. It is as though everyone in boarding school is experiencing avoidant parenting, insofar as you can think of the boarding school as a parent. It's a very avoidant one. So the avoidant people cope with it because they're used to it. I'm not at all saying it's good for them because they become more entrenched, very rigidly and profoundly avoidant. Um, but the secure, anxious, and disorganized people, yes, they have to take on, and this is where Joyce Chavarin describes it so well, a carapace of protection um, to not allow themselves to feel stuff. But that also means they're not feeling what's going on. They lose touch with their own, all that information that should come to us from our own feelings.
Yeah, interesting. And I almost see that you mentioned about avoidance when we get to adults, we struggle in relationship. But most of us leave boarding schools, we go into positions of leadership, whether that's the bar or whether that's politics. And, Professor Antonio Damasio has shown that you cannot make good decisions without the emotional information.
Yes, yes, that's really, really apt point. Yeah, yeah. Emotions are critical source of data for everything. Yeah.
So it's almost like we're being trained in these schools to be avoidant and
Mm.
therefore not to be good leaders.
Yeah, because you can only do things through a cognitive level. Mm.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
What about ambivalence? Is there anything else, especially afterwards, after they leave boarding
Mm.
school?
Mm.
What happens for them then?
Well, I think the description was very moving, that description of the little boy who screamed and then he stopped. But what we can imagine is that the internal screaming didn't stop because it would have gone on. Um, so those children, they can start to behave in a more avoidant way, but inside doesn't mean it's all changed inside. And in my view, both when I was going through it and subsequently as a therapist, I think that people with anxious, I'm being very long-winded, they tend not to do well with education. That's even true of day children, that anxious, ambivalent children often can't benefit as much as others from school. Disorganized is even worse, but this is even more true in a boarding school, I believe. So in my experience, people with quite a strong and anxious, preoccupied pattern, they spend all their boarding years kind of trying to persuade their parents to take them away because it's a nightmare for them, even if they've learnt to do this sort of mask at school. And they're utterly betrayed by their parents. So when it comes to after school, they probably leave without the great CV and great educational pathway. So they may not do so well in jobs. And in relationships, someone who is very wounded in that way, it, it it's sort of counterintuitive in a way, but they will tend to be attracted to someone avoidant in a romantic falling in love. And someone who's avoidant will tend to be attracted to the anxious ambivalent. And is it all right if I describe why that happens? It's my
Please do.
favorite
Yeah, yeah,
topic in all the world. Um,
yeah.
because what we're falling in love with is the underdeveloped part of the self. And actually, Plato said it was falling in love was about rejoining two parts. And so if I'm an avoidant person, I'm more likely to fall in love with someone who has anxious attachment because they represent something that was lost, that's been lost in me. They're able to know about their vulnerability and to show it. And that's sort of almost exciting to me because it's so disallowed internally. Meanwhile, my kind of self-composure and apparent strength is fascinating to the person with anxious, preoccupied attachment because that's part of themselves which was never able to develop because they were always under, oh, I need someone to help me. That was the only way they knew to get by. Um, whereas the avoidant person was never allowed to go, I don't feel I can manage. Who will help me? So they fall in love with each other because they're fascinated by that missing part of the self. And for a while, when they're first in love, there's a wonderful sense of completion. That is when we feel most complete because we've sort of fused with that part that was lost. But then in the course of time, the cocktail of neurochemicals that make us feel that heady in love thing, they go away for everyone. And then we have to face reality. And the reality is, I have put myself in a relationship with someone who represents the part of myself that I have always despised and which I have stamped on and been very horrid to. So then in the relationship, the risk is those two people start treating each other the way they treat the hated part of the self. And that's what in EFT, that's the kind of therapy I now practice, emotionally focused therapy, we call the pursuer withdrawer cycle. The more the one pursues, the more the other withdraws. The more the one withdraws, the more the other pursues. Nobody starts it. It's a figure of eight loop, infinity loop. And is the time for me to read a couple of paragraphs from my book?
Please do. Yeah, yeah. Great.
Because for my book, I interviewed couples who described themselves as contented, and they were all in long-term relationships, and it hadn't been easy to get there, but they'd come to a place of a really solid long-term. So the couple I'm reading from, they were two women, and they'd been together about 20 years. Called in the book, they're called Diana and Kate. So they're real people, just the names are changed, and these are their real words. So Diana is anxiously attached. She's now, at the time I'm talking to them, they've both had quite a bit of therapy, and are both have a really a very strong measure of secure attachment, which we can build over the years. But that was reparative. In the early days, Diana was really very anxious and Kate was very avoidant. So we can see why they were attracted to each other, because they represented that underdeveloped part of the self. So I asked them what happened if they had a fight. How did it go? Um, and what they said was, well, we don't have so many fights now, which is lovely after all the therapy. But they were able to sort of describe to me how it used to be. Diana, and while I had some awareness of about my feelings and about Kate's need for space, I didn't have great awareness, as this was at a time when Kate was not good at talking about it. She's now much better. And her withdrawal could trigger with me. I'm the pursuer. So what she's saying is that her partner Kate, if something difficult came up for Kate, she would go very quiet and sort of probably go to another room and just not want any connection. And Diana would be, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" Um, so she would say, Kate's withdrawal was very triggering for me because she felt abandoned, you see, when Kate went quiet. Um, I would start to get really anxious. So I would pursue, and that was utterly the wrong thing for her. Like it felt bad to her. It was more pressure. And then she says to Kate, maybe you could say what it was like. I would say, come on, let's talk. What's wrong? And Kate now answers, well, I would be, you know the pressure cooker you have with the steam vent. And she made this shape with her hand. And you're just trying to let it naturally off. I would just need that space to manage myself. Diana, right. So when I was coming in saying, what's wrong? Why aren't you talking to me? What was that like for you? Kate, uh, it would be a matter of shutting down even more, getting a little bit more paralyzed. Or sometimes I would manifest it in anger towards you, because that's the other thing that happens for avoidant people. It is a sort of protection, all this shutting down. And at a certain point, it explodes when
Oh,
they can't sustain it any longer.
yeah. Thank you. I can really relate. In my 20s, I would squash, 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 and then I would explode. Not
Mm,
at people. I learnt to always explode at myself, but it was mainly
mm,
self-harming. Or,
mm,
I'd go out, do some silly things. So I could, found that because I'd squashed that anger down over the years, I
mm.
didn't have a way of just allowing it into my consciousness, into my body. There was just so much of it. So,
That's a really good pinpointing of the problem with attachment, that we're not avoidant attachment. We're not equipped for feelings which inevitably we will have to meet.
yeah, 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 yeah. So what do we do if, we are avoidant, and it sounds like most of us who go through the boarding school system are going to be avoidant because that's what everyone wants us to be. How do we become more securely attached? What's the
Mm,
way of, like the couple there you're talking about, sounds
mm,
like they became more securely attached.
mm,
What, what can we do?
mm. I think the process of learning, unlearning, and relearning and repairing um, would can go forward on so many fronts. So it can be um, through coaching, like you do. It can be through all kinds of self-help avenues. I got actually a lot of time for Instagram, certain channels. I don't mean there's lots of things people are saying online which are not at all helpful, but there is tremendously good help out there. Um, Practices such as journaling are great ways of learning. Therapy, I do, obviously, I'm pretty much a believer in therapy, but that isn't available to everyone. It almost always costs money. And I think the other avenues are through whatever way of learning about the self works for someone. So for a lot of people, it comes through the arts, through both um, like reading literature or writing it. I'm just taking off my jacket. Um, so um, um,
Mm.
right, I should go back to where I was really, shouldn't I? Because that wasn't very good. Um, so yeah, for a lot of people, it comes through something creative. So that could be through music, write, literature, art. That could be through the way we engage with those, either doing it creatively ourselves or engaging in other people's creative work. Um, there's a huge amount of learning that happens through literature. That's the more obvious because we're reading about people and hearing about from really good writers. We're hearing about the way characters develop, and we see bits of ourselves. So that those are ways of learning. Obviously, people get that also through films tremendously. Um, but I'm a great believer in people doing it in company. So um, if it's not actually paid for therapy, then some kind of self-help group and all the 12-step groups, which cover so many, obviously all the kinds of addictions, but they also cover, there are 12-step groups for anxiety, depression, so many areas. Any sort of group where people are being thoughtful and kind to each other is going to be good. Um, and building up honesty and authenticity and accountability with the self. So that means recognizing the things I'm doing which aren't helping. So we first of all got to stop them. So most of us are doing some kind of things of a quasi addictive nature. If we've had, if we've got difficult, if we're managing difficult feelings. So we're going to have to acknowledge those and see what we can do about them.
Mm. Thank you.
Um, because really addictions keep us paralyzed. We can't learn. The whole thing about addiction is it keeps us from the information we need, which is knowing what our feelings are.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I can resonate again with so many of those. The arts, I got it really into painting, to writing, the drawing, um,
Mm,
going off to museums, abstract art. I just really
mm,
got into color a lot as part of my healing. Um,
mm.
Childlike painting and drawing. That was really helpful.
Yes.
Um,
Yes, I've heard that using the non-dominant hand, for example.
yeah, I use both hands often when I'm painting,
Mm,
because I find that really helps the hemi-syncing the left and right hemispheres of the brain. There's the Cobra movement from the 50s and 60s, it might be 40s, 50s, from Denmark, Belgium, and they painted like small children and the colors, and I got quite into that. So I did quite a lot of paintings and
mm.
drawings as a child, and I found it so cathartic, allowing the emotion up. Um,
That sounds wonderful. I didn't know about Cobra. That's great. Yeah.
yeah, Copenhagen, Belgium, and Amsterdam, something like that. That's what it stood for,
Right.
Cobra.
And
Um,
the thing I didn't say, which perhaps is the core, is that all these things can help us with self-respect, self-compassion, self-love, and self-discipline. Discipline matters as well. Isn't all like about let's have a chocolate biscuit. It's not like that. Because I think sometimes on online it can sound a bit like that. That it's all about I need more of the cozy stuff, and that isn't always what. Sometimes I need also to find strength and firmness within.
yeah, yeah. So, rounding off with the disorganized attachment, there was something when I was reading your paper last night, I mentioned this before we began, is that another argument that the Boarding School Association kind of says uh, the the people who are positive pro boarding school say if you had a hard life, hard time childhood before going to boarding school, then boarding school is really good. And I read the paper and I was like, oh, it's the first time I've really recognized someone saying, actually, if you're disorganized, boarding school might not be a very good thing. I'd love you to
Mm,
talk a little bit
mm.
to that, please.
Well, I think there are some people whose homes are where they're being abused in different ways at home, that boarding school can be a kind of relief. But I have to say, if if the boarding schools, are going to use that as their promotional literature, well, it's not really very encouraging. Doesn't say much for boarding school that it's slightly better than a very abusive home. But very often children who have been that hurt will not be emotionally equipped to manage being in a boarding school, where actually a lot is being asked of a child. And again, I'm particularly thinking of young children. A lot is being asked that is really pretty unnatural, to go and live in a place with rules and regulations, in a huge group. And I know nowadays they sort of make it feel like a smaller group and all of that. I did read recently, slightly changing the subject, but not wholly, you'll see, paper from 2015 by someone of Indian heritage who had researched, they're in an American university, but they were looking at a certain particular type of orphanages in India, and at the attachment of the children. And they found the attachment to peers was stronger than the attachment to the they had something called a mentor mother and a house mother, I think, and they were in groups of 12. So these were not like desperate big ones. They were groups of 12, which is sort of like a large family. But the attachment of the children was strongest to their peers. So this is not right, because peers are not in a position to make you safe. The idea of attachment relationship is that you're attached to someone who will look after you when a tiger comes. And if you're attached, as I was, to my little 6-year-old friend, she's not going to be able to help me at all. But I should go back now to what you asked, which was about the disorganized. Yes, very, very often they're going to really suffer in boarding school because of the difficulty with regulating. They'll have internal experiences with feelings of very easily triggered by fear. A lot of it is fear. And then they may respond by wanting to run away or run towards with anger. They may respond defensively, trying to attack. And that's obviously neither of those are going to wash at all. You can't run away. You've got to stay where you are. This is the time. At this time, you're meant to be in this place, and that's where you'll be doing this. And obviously, showing aggression will not be popular either.
Yeah, yeah. I could think of quite a few stories of people who got into anger and the
Mm.
dormitory would just surround them shouting psycho
Mm.
really loudly. So it
Mm.
wasn't like, oh, can we help? It was
Yes,
like,
but
no, it
well,
was,
no. I mean, the children are all in an evolutionary sense. They're doing the best, like you said. You were able to spot. No, that's not a good way to go. Let me do this.
mm, mm, yeah, yeah. So segueing a little bit into neurodivergent, you talked a little bit about that when you were in London, about neurodivergent children. What is the impact for them of boarding school? Because I've known and met of quite a few over
Mm.
the years. So I'd love to hear your experience and your thoughts.
I think the bit I said before. So neurodivergent people will have a range of attachment patterns. Some will be securely attached, probably not. Probably, I think I don't know this, but I think it's a lower proportion than the general population because neurodivergent people tend to have so many micro rejections at school and at home and also on the streets or anywhere, just because their behavior is not quite fitting what people want. And so they get these micro rejections, and that's going to push them in a slightly more insecure direction. Um, and their own parents may have struggled to understand and respond appropriately, which can be quite tragic in a family because the parents may have responded much better to a neurotypical sibling. So then the neurodivergent child feels sort of doubly um, discounted. It's a really bad feeling for them. Um, so when they come to boarding school, they have their range of attachment strategies. So it's going to be according, really, I suppose, to their and someone who's already avoidantly attached but neurodivergent. They possibly I should think are probably going to be slightly better off. But um, some of the experiences and behaviors that neurodivergent people might struggle with in the general world, such as being impulsive, difficulty with concentration, being very sensitive to certain stimuli, and then showing their response to that in kind of ways that other people find eccentric. Those sort of responses play very poorly in a boarding school. Impulsivity, that's not liked at all. Lack of concentration. Well, you might not listen to what you're being told to do. That's the first rule in a boarding school, is listen to what you're being told to do. And difficulty focusing on the task. Again, it's all very, in the regimented system, you've got to focus on the task. And I think the sensory one probably could be very painful for neurodivergent people, because everything in the boarding school is so regimented. The food, the time you're going to have your food, the amount of the food, the amount of hot water in your bath, practically. Everything is, so many things are chosen for you. The time you go to bed, the amount of noise. The bell will ring, now it will be silent. Now there's another bell, now everyone's shouting and making a noise. But what it isn't is it's not adaptive to what a child needs.
That's really interesting. Yeah, yeah. And once they've left the school, how do they then reintegrate? What's the pathway forward for the neurodivergent ex-boarder?
It's a good question. I'm just thinking how much of an answer I have. I suppose if I slightly track back, one of the neurodivergent children can often be targeted for bullying in general schools because they are different. And all those sort of very unhappy tendencies that happen in ordinary schools can get magnified in a boarding school. So bullying that happens in a boarding school can be particularly profound, really, because of how 24-hour it is. And I know now there's 24-hour online bullying, so that's sort of made home a whole lot worse as well. But if a neurodivergent child is bullied in boarding school, well, that's something that really does go forward with us, because and needs a lot of healing, because people will go forward into university or a workplace or a relationship with that kind of fear, shame, and the protective strategies that go with it, and those are the kind of protective strategies that make it difficult to have a satisfying relationship. So being, for example, a completely oriented around people pleasing, just doing whatever the other person needs, always focusing on what the other person needs, it depletes the person who's doing it, who's laying themselves down. Actually, it doesn't make the other person happy. If we look at it, in those relationships where one person is falling over themselves to take care of and do everything that the other person wants, usually it's this person who walks away, because they're not really having a real relationship. So it's very unsatisfactory. They sort of might think, well, they're getting their bread buttered, but very often it's not the one who's exhausting themselves who says, I've had enough of this, I'm going. That would be a very healthy response, but they can't usually do that. It's most often that those people get abandoned.
How interesting. Yeah, yeah. It's almost a bit like that pursuer and withdrawal kind of dynamic.
Yeah, it is. It is actually. You're quite right. It is another version of the pursuer withdrawal. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So as we start to kind of wrap this up, there's something there you spoke about in November about learning. How is the learning of each of these groups affected by boarding school?
Yes, I think it's maybe quite subtle what happens here, because I think avoidant children are able to go through the hoops very successfully, which means they'll probably be able to get good exams and so forth. But I think what they're not learning is they're not integrating any of that with their internal world. So they're learning it like this, and they can go and apply it in certain settings. You mentioned the law, for example, they probably apply it in very satisfactory ways. Um, but they haven't got any real integration between themselves and the world, which leaves them in a kind of precarious place where they can get sort of pushed off course. And if they're pushed off course, it can be quite bad. And a lot of people with a strong avoidant strategies will need to use something like alcohol to help keep it all in place. So a lot of addictions. Um, so they're not learning in a way. It's going to be a long time before the avoidant person really kind of, oh, this isn't actually working. Well, it can be a long time. Um, this isn't working. There's a lot I'm going to have to unlearn and then learn from a deeper place. Um, Anxious, ambivalent people, they're probably going to find it harder to do well in the formal learning of the A levels and so forth. Um, and they, what did one of those? There's a book I love to quote from called "Finding Our Way Home,"
Mm.
and it's the stories that one's written by women former boarders, but obviously there's other collections men have contributed to, but that's very good. And one of the writers in that says, what I learnt in boarding school was that I didn't matter. That's what I learnt. And
Right.
that would be particularly, I think, the answer of someone who has an anxious or attachment, or possibly a secure one before, and then they go to boarding school and they learn, I thought I mattered, but I learnt I didn't matter.
Mm.
Um, but of course, there are a lot of important friendships that can be made in boarding school. It isn't the case for everyone. Some people are very isolated, and that's a terrible experience. But a lot of people do have a compensation of some good friendships. Um, and so there is a kind of learning there about something about connection. Um, but I asked AI to tell me about friendships forged in battle because soldiers are it's well known that soldiers make very strong, wonderful emotional bonds.
Mm.
And AI gave me this wonderful description of yes, soldiers, friendships formed in battle tend to be very deep emotional connections because of the shared hardship and the unique experience of being in the military. Well, you could just translate that immediately to boarding school. The shared friendships are very deep because of the terrible hardships that are endured together and this unique experience of being shut up with strangers and made to live with people you don't know.
Mm.
So um, learning there is sort of learning about friendships, but it's in this very unnatural environment, which you can't always then. I mean, I think sometimes people in these sort of important careers we've mentioned, they're able to stay amongst their own boarding school group and they stay with those friends and it kind of works. But they're not often not at all well equipped to make friendships in the general population, which I would see as a terrible handicap
Yeah.
and an impoverishment.
There was a documentary, thank you, Channel 4, Boris Johnson last year. I think it was 4 or 5 episodes, and one of them it just says that he really struggled to make friendships. And you can see that on when he went to Europe, he struggled to make connections. Whereas I've mentioned this before in the podcast, when John Major went in the 90s, he made a really good relationship with Helmut Kohl that
Yes.
eased Britain into the
Yeah.
EC then.
Yeah.
Whereas David
Yeah.
Cameron and Boris Johnson really struggled in Europe.
That
And,
is, I think that's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
um,
Whereas if you put them with their own kind in a cocktail party and they're away, that's perfect. But take them outside that milieu and they struggle. Yeah.
mm, mm. So, is there anything that you shared on in November that you've not covered yet that you're like, oh, I wish I'd spoken about that, or anything else which has come, which you would love to share?
Oh, thank you. Let me think. If there is, I suppose it would be probably there'll be something in there about the couples because that's now my sort of great my own learn. That's the bit where I'm my learning face, as it were.
Mm.
Um, well, it's quite a common occurrence that uh, couples people report having formed a relationship with someone who's been to boarding school and the person themselves hasn't, and they kind of the number of times I've met someone in my own life, and it's certainly happened in therapy, uh, where the non-boarding school person um, kind of they are very convinced that the reason the relationship was a disaster was due to boarding school, and they're like, I'm never going near another boarding school person. And somebody described this to me. She'd had quite a long, reasonably long-term relationship with a boarding school person, and it had become more and more difficult, but turned into pursue a withdrawer with the boarding school person as the withdrawing person. And sadly, sadly, because they were, I believe, both sad about it, um, they separated. And a bit after that, um, she she'd come to a view that his withdrawal and reserve and incapacity to, people would say, do feelings was very much to do with boarding school. Of course, I would say we don't know about the early life, but let's say she's at least half right. And she said a while after that, she was, I don't know if you'd met the person online or anyway, she's sitting in a pub having a first date with a guy. And he mentions he's been to boarding school. She said, you couldn't, it was like grease lightning. I was out of there.
I get messages like that every day,
Right.
from partners
Yeah.
who say they didn't go to boarding schools, their partners did, and they can see that their partner has an issue and they feel
Mm,
it's due to boarding school, whereas the ex-boarder is like, no, I loved it, or there's no problem here, I'm fine.
yeah.
What would you suggest? What if you've got a couple comes to you with that dynamic? What would you
Right.
suggest?
Well, if they've come to me, that's wonderful because then we can sort of work, um, because the avoidant ex-boarder, as you're saying, they're going to be not thinking they want to go to couple therapy. Sometimes they'll, in the end, say, "Oh, I'll come to keep you quiet," thinking we'll just have a session or two. What I can, and this is a happy thing I can report, when you get those couples actually come to therapy, what they both people tend to have a surprise because the um, obviously the couple counselor's whole work is about understanding the experience of both people. And so whatever is the immediate experience of either, and so for the ex-boarder, the immediate experience is, I really don't need to be here. This is actually quite annoying to have my time wasted. Well, then our job as the counselor is to hear that. This must feel really quite annoying for you to be spending time and money when, from your point of view, that we've got to hear where they are. And then we deepen that and hear it more. And it goes to a much deeper place. So the really what I find, even after one session, the more avoidant person, this isn't actually too bad. They feel respected, they feel listened to. Therapy isn't turning out to be the nightmare they had absolutely assumed because they had thought, and what's more, the anxious partner had thought that they'll get them into the room and the counselor will say to the avoidant one, well, you need to do this and you need to do that. And that's never what couple counseling is about. So the avoidant one is relieved and the anxious one is not quite as pleased as they thought they were going to be because they thought that their partner was going to get a little bit of kind of help them get into shape. And in the end, we hope everyone's going to find a new shape. But um, I think you can only do couple counselling if you work from a systemic premise that there's something going on in the system. It's not one person's fault.
Yeah, yeah. So true. I see that quite often. If someone comes to me as a partner of an ex-boarder, then I'm like, right, what's your stuff within that?
Yeah.
And if you
Why are
do
you
that,
so attracted to them? Yeah.
yeah, when you change, the relationship can change.
Yes. Yes.
And when they see that rather than being the victim, moving
Yes.
more into a creator,
Yeah.
I think, yeah, yeah, fascinating. Well, I could talk to you for hours, Annie. So thank you, bless you for your time today. It's been fascinating, and I've got so many other little areas and tangents I could go off on. But how do people find out more about your work?
Oh, you ask such nice questions, Piers. I really enjoyed talking to you. Um, well, the thing that is the most sort of go-to thing I've done is my TEDx talk. So it's on YouTube as well, along with where this will be. And it's called Attachment Theory is the Science of Love. And it's 13 minutes and it gives an introduction for those who are new to attachment theory or a kind of revision for those who are not new to it. And I particularly talk about how attachment works in couples. So that's a very quick read. Or on Instagram, so my name on Instagram is and_attachment. And I do mostly short posts most days. Now and again, I do a longer kind of meatier one. And I also have on my website, I have PDFs. So on my website, which is called Contented Couples, the same as my book, it's called Contented Couples, the website. And I have a resources page where you can download PDFs. So as it's the new year, I've done one for a kind of relationship review PDF where you could download, it's free, of course, um, and download this couple of pages with ideas and questions to reflect on about relationship. Everything is done from an attachment point of view. Anyway, there's another recent one I've put up about care seeking skills in the different um, attachment strategies. So, avoidant people have trouble seeking help. Anxious people tend to seek it, but they do it in a way that tends to misfire. They sound like they're complaining. They think they're saying, please help me, but actually criticizing often their partner. That's often how it works out. And yes, so that's another place, resources, but also do my book is here because I read from it. I didn't know it, but it is there. And yeah, my book, is that too sweet? The reason I really believe in this book is I interviewed 18 couples, really lovely couples, all real people. Just the names have changed. And some of them met through romance, some of them met through dating sites or through friends, so what I call self-arranged, that group. And then some of them are arranged marriages, not forced. That's quite different. These are arranged marriages where they're done with family agreement. And I interviewed all these couples decades into their relationship and heard about the sort of ups and downs and how they made it work. And um, they're very beautiful stories. So, and then I try and sort of interpret them with this attachment lens to make sense of it from thinking of the pursuer and the withdrawer.
Mm. Yes, and I really recommend it. I really enjoyed reading it. Before I spoke to you last year before, it gave me a lot of ideas, and I love the way you put the stories in because it helps the book to really flow. It doesn't feel so academic.
Mm.
So I really picked up a lot. So well recommended. So, well, thank you, Annie. It's been a real pleasure. And yeah, if I can support your work in any way, please do let me know.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.